Welcome to Kicks and Minivans, the podcast for dads, especially the ones that love sneakers. I'm your host, KG. However you're watching and listening, man, we appreciate you hanging out with us, joining us for this week's episode. I'm very excited for this one. Hey, before we jump into it, though, I want to share a word about our sponsor, N8 Solutions. Nate is a great leader and leadership coach. I have sat in his leadership sessions. He has a passion for helping men unleash their best from within, get to their healthiest point where they can figure out their calling, their assignment, their purpose. I've benefited greatly from his friendship and his leadership, and I know that you would too. So if you're in a spot where, hey, you're trying to figure out like what's next in your life, how to reach that next level in your career or your personal life, or struggling working through some things, man, Nate is a great resource. You can head over to n8leader.com, get a free consultation. He's not pushy, he's not salesy. He just wants to help you be your best. This podcast is all about helping men be in their healthiest spots for their families. And so would definitely advise you go check out Nate and see what he has to offer you. Well, before we jump into the meat of today's episode, I want to welcome back my wife yet again for another draft. Word on the street is that she's kicked my butt in the first couple drafts that we did. So I felt the need. I gotta keep it going. Gotta try to get some revenge on this one. You know what I'm saying? So we are doing a draft of favorite kids movies, best kids movies. Not just our personal favorites, but best kids movies. And as we were putting the list together, we were like, yo, there's so many good live action ones and so many good animated ones. So we broke it into two categories. So this one is best live action kids movies drafts. Here we go. That's 2 out of 3.
Okay.
Or just straight up?
Just one.
Just one?
Just
okay.
one. Ready?
Rock, on, shoot.
Okay.
Rock, paper, scissors, shoot. Woo! First pick, give me Space Jam. Yup.
That was my number one. I was hoping I could go first.
Yup.
Okay.
Sorry.
My first pick is Elf.
Oh, good choice. Good choice. Going with a Christmas movie that soon in it though?
Who doesn't like Elf?
I don't know. Old people? I don't know.
That's for kids.
It is. I know. You asked the question. I just answered it. I don't know I don't know them. I'm not friends with them if they don't like that movie. Not friends with you because you don't like that movie.
Sure.
I don't have friends that don't enjoy it. Okay.
My parents don't like Elf, but
Alright. I had this one. Really?
they don't like Will Ferrell.
I don't either. That's literally the one thing that I like him in.
Yeah. Same.
It's the only thing that I like him in. Is Elf. But alright. For my second one, I'm gonna go with a Christmas movie too. Home Alone.
No, that was my third.
Woo! Give me Home Alone, baby.
Okay, I'm gonna have to do
It's a classic. It's a great one. And his name's Kevin.
Okay. Alright, so this is my number 2. Did you ever see Heavyweights?
No. Never heard of it.
Well, Heavyweights.
Heavyweights? Okay. For my third overall, give me Parent Trap.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Give me Parent Trap with my third.
Lindsay Lohan.
I'm going to take that one. Not my personal favorite, but it's like, I feel like it's a classic.
All right. Hopefully I can recover from this one. The Goonies.
The Goonies. I don't know if I've ever actually seen it.
No?
No.
It's a classic.
I believe you. All right. For my number 4, you may not have even had this on your list, but I binged this trilogy of movies so many times as a kid. Give me Star Wars. Yeah. Specifically, like episode 4, just because that was like the first one, but like the whole thing, you know. And you know I love Star Wars.
Yeah, I didn't even dare write that on my list.
It's a kids movie, though.
It is.
Like I love it as an adult still, but there it is.
All right, number 4, Matilda.
Oh, good one. I did have that one on my list, but that's a very, very good one. Again, not one of my favorites, but it's a classic one, though. All right, for my 5th one, this was deserving of a first-round pick, but I knew you wouldn't pick it, and so I just let it slide to 5 because I knew I would get the steal at 5. The Sandlot.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen that?
I didn't really like it as a kid. I know. Very divisive. but it wasn't my movie.
That movie was my childhood.
I know.
Like, that was literally what we did all summer long growing up, was like the Sandlot. Like, just played ball all summer long. That was my childhood, that movie. I think I watched it like every day one summer.
Yeah.
Every single day. You didn't like it. Our kids will like it. Our kids will like it.
Sorry. Okay.
Your last one?
I don't know. I might be handing this over to you if I say this one. But
You've already handed it over to me. The people will decide.
I saw this movie so many times as a kid. Homeward Bound.
Homeward Bound. That's a nice, like, heartwarming movie.
It is. Puppies.
Speaking of which.
Come here.
Today in this week's episode, we're going to be tackling a little bit of a tough topic, man. We're going to talk about the roommate phase of marriage. This is I've started seeing this trend a lot on social media. People are talking about surviving the roommate phase, or they're struggling in the roommate phase currently. And basically, what the roommate phase is it's a stage of marriage that not everyone goes through. And some people that go through it, it's a short season. Some it feels like a really long season. But it's when your marriage reaches a point where you lack passion, you lack excitement and fun. All your conversations are about work or chores or the kids. Your emotional and sexual and physical intimacy is on the decline. You do fewer and fewer things together. And your marriage is more about coexisting than about thriving, more about just kind of being there instead of romance, instead of passion. It's when your relationship just lacks passion. And that's one of the underlying themes of the roommate phase, is a lack of passion. And here's the thing where it's dangerous for us guys is that women notice the lack of passion far before dudes do. Right? They notice it. Like, if you're noticing a lack of passion in your marriage, there's a good chance your wife has like been on to that for a while now. Where if you said like, hey, I feel like our marriage is lacking passion a little bit, she's like, oh, really, Sherlock? Women tend to catch on to that a lot quicker than men do. Men notice the lack of sex, but they don't necessarily notice the lack of passion in the way that women do. And this roommate phase, I very often hear it termed for couples that are kind of in the phase that I'm in right now, where they have little kids running around the house, possibly a couple under 3, a couple under 4, 2 or 3 kids in that toddler baby phase before they start school. What I'll see is like couples on TikTok where they're like, hey, like our kids are in their teens now and we survived the roommate phase and now we're thriving. And it's like, all right, but like, do you just have to survive that phase? Right? And the roommate phase isn't necessarily just associated with couples in that demographic with little kids in the house. It can be for couples at any stage of their marriage. Because typically what research, science is showing is that marriages start off very happy, right? Like you get married, you're happy. And even though the first year of marriage is scientifically proven to be one of the hardest years of marriage, also is one of the happiest years. You just got married, you're in that honeymoon phase, the newlywed phase, you can't keep your hands off each other, all that. And then it shows across the board in marriages that happiness kind of generally is on a decline from there, which just kind of sounds really, really sad. It doesn't always have to be that way. It's not always that way. Obviously, it's like you meet couples that are married 50, 60 years and just love each other, just crazy over the moon, just super happy with the life that they built. But you meet others that aren't, and so there's kind of this wide spectrum. And here's, I think one of the hard parts in it is when it lacks passion, the women notice it first. And that doesn't surprise me because of the fact that women initiate 70% of divorces in our country. Right? 70% of divorces in America are initiated by the woman. And if it's a couple, if it's a marriage with a college educated woman, that percentage spikes to 90%. Right? So in in marriages across the board, 70% of women initiate divorce. In marriages where the female is college educated, that spikes to 90%. And there's a whole list of conclusions that you could draw from that. However, it's kind of reflective on us guys that we might not notice what's going on. And by the time we do, it might be too late. Right? And so I felt a need to kind of address this a little bit. Because I don't think it has to be that way. Right? Like, you don't have to live in a marriage where you're not excited to be around each other. You don't have to live in a marriage where you're just coexisting and just going through the motions. Right? And so what I want to do in today's episode is just take a look at some of the characteristics of the roommate phase where you might say like, hey, I noticed this is happening. That relates to me. Maybe there's a problem, something deeper that I need to look into. And then I want to talk about a couple things to do to kind of correct and get you headed in the right direction. Because like I said, I don't think marriages, if you're in a roommate phase, you don't have to stay there. And I think it's important to clarify too, like, in a relationship, you go through different seasons with it, right? Like me and Beck were just talking just a minute ago before recording, and I was talking about, there was a week a couple years ago when I was working still that I had a 100-hour work week. And I told her, I was like, that week, she was also on night shift that week. Like that week, I felt like roommates, right? But I was working 100 hours that week. Like, I had no time for anything else that specific week, but that wasn't a normal week, right? And so if you look at it and say like, all right, external circumstances caused us to feel like roommates, like ships passing in the night for that specific short, brief period of time. Right? And so I think the roommate phase isn't necessarily descriptive of like, oh, this brief short thing caused us to feel like roommates for a week or two, right? It's more of a pattern of weeks or months or even years where you feel like you're not connecting, where you feel like you're just kind of coexisting instead of thriving, where your marriage is more and handling the kids, where your marriage and handling the kids is more about logistics than romance, and about caring about each other. And so the external circumstances can't be like, oh, well, our little kids are causing us to feel like roommates, because them kids gonna be there a long time, bro, and you better figure this out. Because otherwise you're going to look up 20 years from now and barely know the person that you're looking at. Right? And so this isn't, these external circumstances for this brief period of time, this week or two, cause us to feel like roommates. Like, no, this is a pattern. Right? So let's get into some of the characteristics. This one is like an easy one right off the bat. If you're easily triggered when the other person walks in the room. Right? Like, bro, this feels even silly to say because I'm like, why would you be triggered by your wife? Or why would you be triggered by your husband? Like, and I wanna say before we go deeper into this, I'm specifically gonna be talking to the men in this episode. This is a podcast to help men win in marriage and parenting. We love the ladies, obviously. And there might be things that you gain from this. I'm specifically talking to the men, to the bros. So hey, if you're a lady, keep on listening. I hope this is beneficial to you as well. But, send this to you, man. Listening to him, with him together. I'm specifically talking to the men. But the first characteristic, easily triggered by the other person, right? Like, the moment they walk in the room, like, you're on edge. Right? And, like, they don't even have to say nothing or do anything. Like, and you're just on edge. And I don't understand this one, but it's like, I hear enough people talk about it that relate to that. And I'm just like, what? Like, why would you get married to someone that you don't enjoy being with? Right? Like, that makes no sense to me. But like, if you get triggered by their presence alone, safe to say that's an easy sign that you might be in the roommate phase. 2, on the flip side of that, you spend a lot of time in separate rooms of the house. Right? And it's cool to have hobbies. It's great to have your own individual things. I actually think that's healthy for a marriage if you each have your own individual hobbies, right? Like, I enjoy playing video games here and there. I don't play nearly as much as I would like to, but I enjoy turning the Xbox on. I enjoy watching the Sixers. I enjoy going to hoop or working out. It's good to have your individual hobbies, but if you're spending the majority of your time in separate rooms of the house, whether you got kids or no kids, if you spend all your time gaming and she spends all her time doing whatever, that might be a sign that you're in the roommate phase. And yes, opposites attract. That's true. But you should still have things that you enjoy doing together. Like, what brought you together in the first place? Without saying sex. Because sex is not a great reason to get married. It's a great benefit of marriage, but it's not a great reason to get married. Because that can't hold a marriage together. But if you're spending the majority of your time in separate rooms of the house doing separate things, might be a sign that you're in the roommate phase. If your conversations are largely meaningless, if they're all just boiled down to talking about logistical matters, like who's driving the kids where, what are we doing for dinner, who's paying this bill, who's doing that. If your conversations, if you're not talking, if you're not getting deeper, if you're not learning, I was just listening to another dad podcast, and one of the dudes said, always be a student of your wife. And I love that. Like, I know my wife better than I know anybody else on the planet. And sometimes I feel like I know her better than she knows herself. And I feel like she knows me better than I know myself. Like, there's things that she calls me out on. And I'm like, I don't know why I'm struggling with this. And she's like, well, you're struggling with this because A, B, C, D, E. And I'm like, oh, that makes a lot of sense, right? Like, but she's a student of me. I'm a student of her, right? Like, I never want to stop learning about my wife. But if your conversations are boiled down to just solving logistical things, like who's doing the grocery shopping, who's Ubering the kids this week, who's cooking dinner, like, you're not a student of your spouse anymore. You're not learning about her. You're not learning about him. You're not getting to know them deeper. And then you're not connecting on that emotional level, creating that emotional intimacy. It's another sign, a characteristic of the roommate phase. Next, your spouse isn't your number one, right? For me, it's a very clear-cut order in my life. Like, God is number one. As a Christian, as a Jesus follower, like, God is number one, always has been, always will be. My wife is right after him. And then my kids. And I know that's a hot topic, right? Like, if your kids come first, if your spouse comes first, that's probably a whole nother episode, but my wife comes first. My wife comes before my kids. But it's God, my wife, my kids, and then it's everything else. And the order of everything else might change in and out of season, right? Like, right now, like, this podcast is pretty high on the list because I'm putting a lot of time and energy and effort into it. So we really appreciate you rocking with us. My fitness is really high on that list right now because we're going to Punta Cana soon, right? Like, your boy trying to shred a few before that, right? Like, I always care about my fitness. It's not as much of a driving force usually as it is right now, right? Like, this podcast, it will have its times where I have to put a ton of energy into it, and then it will have times where it's like, hey, we're kind of doing this episode, right? Like, right now is one of those seasons where I'm putting a ton of energy, right? Like, other things come and go. None of them ever come before my wife or kids, and my kids don't come before my wife. She remains the priority in my life. And so if other things are catapulted over your wife in terms of priority, that's a sign of the roommate phase right there. Like, your wife should be, it should be God, your wife, your kids. And if you're not a Jesus follower, if you're not a Christian, then your wife should be your number one. You know? And I love my wife better because of my relationship with God. I can love my wife better because of my relationship with God, and he will always stay number one. And that helps me deliver to her. She's better in the number two spot than the number one spot because of what God is doing in my life. But if your spouse isn't your priority, if other things or other people are ahead of your spouse, that's a sign of the roommate phase. No emotional intimacy, right? That goes back to that talking and that number one thing. If your conversations aren't allowing you to develop that emotional intimacy where you can lean on each other, you can support each other, you can encourage each other, right? And it's one of those things where it's like, hey, I don't have to catch my wife up on anything, right? Like, my wife knows everything that's going on in my life. Like, she knows what's stressing me out. She knows what's overwhelming me. She knows all that. Like, I don't, like, if something were to happen tonight, like, I don't have to, like, tell her a 30-minute story to get her up to speed. Like, I just have to be like, hey, so you know this thing? Well, this thing happened. And she knows what's going on, right? Like, and it's the same thing vice versa with me with her. You should have that level of emotional connection with your wife. And if not, it's probably a sign of the roommate phase. right? And the last sign, and there's probably more, right? But these are the ones that I feel like are kind of prevalent. But the last sign is the lack of physical intimacy. And that's both of the sexual and the non-sexual matter, right? Not all physical intimacy needs to be sexual intimacy, and not all physical intimacy even needs to lead to sexual intimacy, right? And that's something we as men, as a gender, probably could do a little bit better on, right? But like, hey, are y'all holding hands when you're driving or walking somewhere? Like, if you're watching a movie together, are you on opposite ends of the couch? Are you cuddling on it? Like, touching her forearm when you're talking? Like, creating that physical intimacy where you're connecting on that level. If you're never touching, if you're never having sex, if you have no rhythm of sex in your marriage, you're entering the roommate phase, right? And this is the part where guys notice it. This is the part of the whole list of everything I just talked about. This is the part guys notice first, right? We notice the lack of physical intimacy, of sexual intimacy before all those other things, right? And then when we bring it up, we're like, hey, we ain't having sex. Well, she's like, well, all of these things, right? And we're going to talk about that more in just a minute. But in your marriage, you should have some sort of rhythm of sex, right? And not like, some people will say schedule your sex, right? And like, that feels kind of weird, but like, for some couples it works, for some couples it doesn't. But you should have some sort of rhythm of sex inside of your marriage, right? And every couple's different, every person's different, they have different drives, and logistics of their life allow for different things, right? Like, but you should have some sort of rhythm, you know, whether it's whatever it is, right? I don't want to get into all that. But like, if your rhythm is like once a year on your birthday, that's not a healthy rhythm of sex, right? Not saying that like, hey, y'all got to go get it on 5 or 6 nights a week. However, you know, whatever that healthy rhythm is for you guys, and the rhythms can change, right? Like, our rhythm changed after kids entered the picture. Our rhythm changed when she went full-time nights. Our rhythm changed again when she came off a night shift, right? So those rhythms can change, but you should have some sort of rhythm of physical, sexual intimacy inside of your marriage. Because if you don't, like, you're literally roommates, right? Like, you're literally playing house together. These are all characteristics of the roommate phase. And if we're honest, like, if you're lacking all those things, it feels a lot like if I just described a relationship between two people with all that, like, it sounds like not a married couple. It sounds like two people that are just living in the same house, paying rent together, right? And there's other things where it's like, hey, you could get into like, if y'all ain't sleeping in the same room, that's a major flag. If you ain't sharing your money, joint bank account sort of thing, like, that's a major flag. If y'all don't trust each other to go through each other's phone, that's a major flag, right? Like, there's different levels to this. These are some of the ones that were kind of poking out at me of things that I hear about, see on social media, trending and all that kind of stuff. So what I want to do is talk about a couple of these things you can do if you feel like you've entered the roommate phase. And again, remember, I'm talking to men primarily. And if you feel like, hey, we might be in the roommate phase of our marriage, there's a good chance that she's felt like that for a lot longer. She just hasn't talked about it. And so, first thing, if you're listening to this, I'm going to assume you want to do something to right your marriage. I'm going to assume, I'm not going to even try to convince you that you want to get your marriage out of the roommate phase. Like, I'm not even going to try to convince you. I'm just going to assume, right? And so, you know, remember why you got married in the first place. Remember the feelings you had for her when you were engaged, the day of your wedding, like all that. I'm not going to sit here this episode try to convince you that you want to save your marriage. I'm just going to assume if you're already this far into it and still listening, I'm going to assume that you do want to do that. But the first thing, man, talk about what's happening. And this is an awkward conversation to have. This is awkward as heck. But, like, it has to happen. Like, someone has to breach the conversation. Someone has to open the door and start the conversation of like, hey, I feel like we've been acting like roommates more than like husband and wife. Right? And like I said, if you feel like you're acting more like roommates, there's a very good chance she's felt like that a lot longer. And she will appreciate you taking the initiative and the leadership in your marriage to open that door, have that conversation, and start dialoguing about it. The next thing, and this might seem counterproductive, it's what I'm trying to get at, but I think it's important, get yourself to a healthier spot. Like if you've let yourself go physically, go back, listen to episode 7 of this podcast with Coach Montel, the Fit Father. Like get yourself to a healthier spot. Start hitting the gym, start eating right. If you feel like you're struggling mentally, emotionally, like go talk to somebody, sit down with a therapist. There's no shame in going to counseling, right? Like some of the greatest things that I've done have been in the counselor's office. Some of the largest leaps I've taken personally have been sitting down with a therapist and talking about it. There's no shame in that. If you feel like you're stuck in your career, if you got no drive in life, like go to n8leader.com, talk to our sponsor, Nate. Like he would love to sit down and help you figure out your purpose and your calling and your assignment and where you're going in life. Like if you feel like you're just lacking, because if you're lacking vocationally or physically or emotionally or mentally, like that will bleed into your marriage. And so getting yourself to a healthier spot will allow you to be at your best for your wife and your kids. This is why we talk about it so much. Take care of yourself, take care of your family, like because you can be the best dad and husband you can be when you are the best that you can be. And so if you need help getting to a healthier spot, hire a fitness coach, hire a therapist, hire a leadership coach. Do what you have to do to get yourself to a healthier spot. And don't do that before you have this, like, don't say like, hey, I'm going to get healthier and then we'll fix our marriage. Like, nah, these things can happen simultaneously, but healing yourself, getting to a healthier spot yourself will help you get your marriage to a healthier spot. Next, prioritize your time with your wife. Right? Like, I know you need time for your own hobbies. You come home from work, you need to decompress, all that. But, like, if your marriage is important to you, prioritize your time together. This might mean that you spend less time on your individual hobbies. Right? Like, we talked about not spending hours and hours gaming every single night a couple episodes ago. Like, go back and listen to episode 12 again if that's an issue for you. But, like, it might mean you spend less time on individual hobbies. Right? Like, before I got married, like, I watched every single NBA game. I watched all the Phillies games, all the Eagles games, all the Sixers games, like all that. When I got married, I didn't have time for that. Right? Now, I still catch some of them. Like, I still catch some Sixers games. I'll catch some, NBA playoffs are about to start. It's kind of like my wife knows I'm going to be wanting to watch a lot more basketball. I'm not going to be watching every night, but it's like, hey, sometimes that's something we do together where it's like, hey, big Sixers game tonight. Like, we're playing the Celtics. Like, let's go. Let's make some game food. Let's snack together. Let's eat together. Hang out and do this thing together. It might mean you spend less time on your individual hobbies, or it might mean you do some of those things together. But either way, like you're prioritizing your time together, right? Like have her start teaching her some of your hobbies. Start learning some of her hobbies, right? Like do things together. Whatever brought you together, bonded you together when you first started dating, when you were engaged, when you were newlyweds, like whatever those things were, not just sex, but like whatever those things were, like do those things together. Come back to that. Spend that time together, right? Like have consistent date nights, right? Like date nights are so underrated, yo. Like they're some of my favorite times because it's times that we set out, and this is like become even more important when we have kids. Like this is even more vital and important. I always love date nights before kids, but like with kids, it's even more important because this is time where we intentionally put aside on our calendar that say like, hey, this time is between you and me. And we try our best to not like bring up kids, although we usually very often do bring up kids or we're talking about, but usually often in like the cute way of like, oh, Jace did this, or like, oh, look at this cute picture of Corey, wanted to wear his hat. Like, we do things like we do that, but having intentional rhythms of date night in your marriage is so crucial, man. And it doesn't have to be extravagant. You don't have to spend a ton of money. It doesn't have to be, several times a week or even every week, but having a rhythm of date night, right? So this is what we do for date night in our house. We do 2 date nights a month. One's an in-the-house date night and one's an out-of-the-house date night. And we take turns planning them, right? And so like this month, I plan the in-the-house date night and my wife's planning the out-of-the-house one. And then next month I'll plan the out the house, she'll plan the in the house. And so we just kind of take turns planning planning the date nights. And like I said, it's nothing extravagant. Like, we budget in our monthly household budget, we budget $100 a month for date nights. And so, you know, when we're planning them, we kind of like bounce back and forth. And usually like our in-house is like $30. Our out-the-house date night's like $70. But it's like we'll kind of communicate and be like, hey, I need $40 this month for the in-the-house. Is that cool? Does that fit your plan? And they're like, yeah. You know, so it's like we plan it out. But like, hey, we each plan a date. We do, and it kind of puts like a little bit of pressure on you, you know, to like not just do the same old, like, oh yeah, we're going to go fancy like Applebee's on a date night, like, you know what I mean? It puts a little pressure on you to be a little creative, a little unique, but you don't have to spend a ton of money, right? Like, it doesn't have to be this big extravagant thing, but the point of it is that you're intentionally spending time together. You and her, nothing else on the table. And don't talk about these logistical things. Like, if you have to talk logistics on stuff, like, do that. But like, get to know your wife better on these date nights. Right? Like, be a student of your wife. Get to know her. Ask her questions, man. Like, get to know her on a deeper level. Connect emotionally, mentally, spiritually. Spend that time together where it's just the two of you, man. Like, take it back to when you were first together. Whatever sparked that romance in you, man. Like, but do it consistently. Spend that quality time together. Continue getting to know, continue being a student of your spouse, learning more and more about her, man. Like, my wife is my favorite subject in the world. I love learning about my wife. And I feel like I do learn more about her every single day. Like, I'm not just saying that to sound cliche or cheesy. Like, I feel like I'm learning a little bit more about her every day. And that helps because then there's things that I can help her figure out because maybe I can see something differently. And there's things for me that she can help me figure out because, well, I'm so stuck in my head, I can't see clearly, and she gives me an outside look. But that's because she's a student of me as well. She's learning about me just as I'm learning about her, and we can help each other and build each other up in that way. And that's how marriage is designed to be. That we could be there to encourage and support each other and strengthen each other. Lastly, create emotional and physical intimacy. And not just sexual intimacy, but non-sexual physical intimacy. Right? And here's the thing, and here's where it gets so blurry for guys and women, right? Because like I said, like, women notice the lack of passion, guys notice the lack of sex in a marriage. And for guys, physical intimacy leads to connection. Physical intimacy leads to emotional intimacy, but women are the opposite of that, where emotional intimacy leads to physical intimacy for them, right? So sex creates connection for us. Connection leads to sex for them. And so, you know, if you polled the general public of dudes and asked them, like, hey, if your wife came home from work and said, hey, let's go to the bedroom and get it on, like 99.9% of dudes would be like, bet. Drop everything they're doing, cut the video game off, like whatever they're doing, like they would cut it off and they would follow her, right? If you polled the general population of women and asked them, like, hey, if your husband came home from work and said, hey, drop what you're doing, let's go to the bedroom and get it on, I'm not sure what the number would be. It would not be as high as for the men, right? But that's because for men, the physical intimacy leads to connection. But for women, it's the opposite. When they feel connected, that leads to the physical intimacy. And so as men, it's like I heard someone say, like, every positive thing you do in a relationship is foreplay. Right? Which is like funny to like think about and hear. But like there's a point to it. Right? Where it's like, hey, continue building that emotional intimacy. Continue building that connection. Foster that like all the time. Right? And this isn't like, don't be a douche and do this and say like, hey, if I foster this, if I send like this encouraging text, if I buy her flowers, if I do this, like, then like, that means I'll get some tonight. Like, nah, man, like, don't do that. Right? Like, don't play that game. Like, create connection, create emotional intimacy because you care about your wife, you love her, and you want to get to know her. Right? And that should lead to physical intimacy, but like, not all physical intimacy needs to be of the sexual nature. As a generalization of men, we could probably get better at non-sexual physical intimacy, right? Giving her a massage without expecting anything in return, like holding hands, rubbing her back. Like I think a big deal is kissing before you leave for work. Like, it doesn't have to be a peck on the cheek. Like, make out for a little bit. Like, make out sessions are mad underrated. I'm really sorry if, like, my in-laws or my parents are listening to this one. But, like, make out sessions are mad underrated. Like, I don't care if your kids are watching. Like, right, my kids are little. Like, maybe the feeling on that will change when they're a little bit older. I don't know. If you got teenagers, if you're a parent of teenagers, like, hit me back. Let me know what that's like. But, like, make out before you leave for work. In front of the kids, whatever. Like, have that physical connection without just always expecting sex in return. Right? Because that physical connection, man, like, physical touch is my love language. And so it's like, I'm even a little bit higher on it than a lot of other guys. But, like, man, it's like, it doesn't always have to be sex for me to feel connected to my wife. But that physical touch, man, it's like where it's like, hey, even if she's putting her hand on my forearm or holding my hands or rubbing my leg or something, it's like, hey, that breeds connection for me, right? And so it's like we can do that to breed connection without just expecting sex all the time, right? And roommates don't do that, right? Like, roommates don't necessarily have that emotional connection, that physical connection. If it's two dude roommates, that might be weird anyway. But, like, the point of all of this, the point of this whole episode is getting out of the roommate phase of marriage. And so these things, getting yourself to a healthier spot, talking about what's happening, having that time together, creating the emotional, the physical, the sexual connection between the two of you, man, like, this is stuff that it's like, hey, if y'all have been out of sync for a while, you're not just going to flip a switch, have a conversation, and, like, everything's back to normal, right? Like, it ain't necessarily that simple. I also don't think it's that complicated, man. Like, if y'all are in love, and love is not a feeling, it's a choice, right? And so it's like, yeah, there's feelings associated with it, but it's like, I choose every single day to wake up and love my wife. Even if she did something that annoyed me, even if I'm upset or disappointed in something, it's like, hey, I am making a conscious decision to choose my wife. And you can make that conscious decision to choose your wife as well. Because I genuinely don't believe there's a better person on this planet for me. Like, I think God knew what he was doing when he created her and created me and brought us together. Like, I believe in that, and I believe in that for you too. And so if you do believe in that, like, if you believe your wife is your one, man, like, act like it. Put her first. Make her a priority. Spend intentional time with her. Have a conversation with her about where your marriage is at. Create emotional intimacy. Create physical intimacy. Be a student of your wife. And don't just do it all for sex, but, like, yeah, that should be an important part of your marriage as well. So this is the drop, man. If you feel like you are stuck in the roommate phase, man, I encourage you, have that conversation with your wife. Like, just breach the topic. Breach it, man. Because it has to be broken. Have that conversation with your wife. Get yourself to a healthier spot. Create time together. Like, be intentional. Be intentional about the time that you're spending with your wife. Create that emotional intimacy. Open up. Be vulnerable with her. That's not a natural thing for guys to do, but it's like, man, it's super unnatural for me to be vulnerable because I feel like my vulnerability has been exposed as weakness so often in my life that it's really hard for me to open up and trust people. But I know every single time I do that with my wife, she knows how hard it is for me, and she appreciates that. She appreciates that I trust her enough to be vulnerable and be open with her. So it's like, man, hey, that breeds emotional connection with the two of us, though. Like, that grows that emotional intimacy between the two of us when I'm vulnerable with her. So it's like, hey, whatever you have to do, be intentional about it. Create that time together. Create that connection. Reach out, talk to somebody if you need help, man. If you need to message me, I'd love to chat with you. DM us on Instagram at Kicks and Minivans. Man, would love to chop it up with you. But go talk to a fitness coach, talk to a therapist, talk to a leadership coach, n8solutions.com. Like, whatever it is that you have to do to get yourself to a healthier spot, man, do that. Do that. Praying for y'all. Love y'all. Take care of yourself. Take care of your family. This is Kicks and Minivans.